Lakshan, you're too young to be a millennial, but you're too old to be a Gen Z. Wait, so you remember floppy disks? And so you spent your childhood playing outside, but your teenage years online? That doesn't really make any sense to me. You see, I actually hear statements like these more often than you think. Because while most people are very familiar with millennials and Gen Z, especially thanks to us here at Mind the Gen Gap, what they don't really understand is that not all millennials experience the millennial generation growing up the same way, and not all Gen Z experience growing up the same way across the Gen Z generation, right? And I am one of those people. There's actually an informal name for us, and we're called Zillennials. It's basically a mix of Gen Z and millennials. Creative, I know. But that is what we're going to be talking about in this episode. Hello, everybody. My name is Lakshan, and I'll be your host for today's episode.
Hi, and I'm Goldie, and this is episode 8 of Mind the Gen Gap podcast.
So, in this episode, we're diving deep into the world of Zillennials and the concept of a microgeneration. We're going to be talking about what Zillennial is, why this concept exists, how they're different from millennials and Gen Z, and the role that they play in the workplace. So, first off, let's get this out of the way. What the hell is a Zillennial? Zillennials basically refers to the cohort of people that were born approximately between 1992 and 2002. Some would debate that it's between 93 and 98 or 94 and 91. It's still up for debate, but let's just say, to simplify matters, it is the generation or the cohort of the generations born between 92 and 2002. Hence, as we are on the cusp of the millennial and Gen Z generations, we are also called cuspers for that reason. There is another set of cuspers that will be discussed in the next episode, where Goldie will talk about a different microgeneration, but that is for the next episode. You're here for me today. Um, the way to explain this concept of a microgeneration, it's like, when it comes to colors on a spectrum, right? There is green and there's blue. And then there's a gradient between green and blue, where there's like this bluish green or this greenish blue. Like, the colors in between are not distinct enough to have their own name, but they're still unique enough to be notable. That's how these micro generations work. They are a transition between two generations, which leads to the next question of, why does this concept even exist? Well, let's take the example of the millennial generation. Those born in the early 80s would have a significantly different experience growing up than those in the mid 90s, like myself. We grew up watching totally different TV shows, listening to different music, playing with different video game consoles. For example, they grew up playing the Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1, while as we grew up playing PS2, the Game Boy Advance, Xbox 360, and so on. And we experienced different cultural events and different technologies as well. Yet, both of us, that is the early 80s people and the mid 90s guys, are bracketed to be part of the same generation. And that's what makes this concept relevant. For example, most millennials were in a very messy situation during the 2008 financial crisis, because most of them were adults or entering adulthood. But the rest of us were still in school. And that's actually a very good way to look at Zillennials. You can think of them as the cohort of people who were between, say, primary school, first grade, and high school, 12th grade, in 2008. That's one way to remember, okay, what are these Zillennials, right? So, Goldie, in a previous episode, you spoke about how the way I experienced 9/11 would have been very different to how your brother experienced it, who happens to be an elder millennial. What have you noticed about elder millennials and Zillennials?
First of all, cross between blue and green would be aquamarine.
Okay.
So there you go. That's your
It's fancy
color.
words. Just fancy words.
Zillennials are the aquamarine generation. How does that sound? I
That
just
sounds cool.
coined something.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Yeah. Okay. So coming back to your question, for me, as I was listening to you, and obviously you refreshed a nice example for me about 9/11 and the experience felt by you, who's a late millennial. Now we speak about you as a zillennial and an early millennial. In this case, it was actually my brother who I had referred to in episode 2. I think what I pick up here is the vast speed at which technology moved in that bracket of years that millennials were growing up from being children to adolescents to young adults, and the speed at which things changed. And I think what I want to differentiate here is that the older millennials are like a hybrid of analog and digital. They did grow up evidently in a time when the internet was still just picking up, more or less. Whereas the Zillennials are more, we had it in our teenage years already, helping us to find our social status. As you mentioned, a few video games. This was just one more thing that was occurring. But if I were to sort of give it a very real picture, I think what I'm seeing is the early millennials was still a mix of television and going into streaming platforms. But we're not even talking about your Netflix and your medias and Amazon medias. We're talking about streaming platforms where we were downloading things off the internet illegally. And then we saw you guys, the Zillennials, sort of the later millennials, much more YouTube and TikTok savvy, because you are actually able to watch full films on YouTube, whereas I don't think the early millennials had that opportunity just then. So this is the nuanced difference between early millennials and Zillennials in my view. And I think the overarching umbrella would be technology.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that, Goldie, because I remember when I was growing up, we had computers and they were at home, and I would ask my dad, "Can you turn this thing on for me? Please show me how this works. Can you teach me how to install this?" And so on and so forth. And now, of course, we're in a place where I'm teaching my dad everything. But I presume that early millennials did not really grow up with a computer in their house per se. Maybe they had to go elsewhere to make use of it. I mean, I don't know. You would know better than I would.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a fair statement, there's a lot of grain of truth in that. And if you happen to be a millennial growing up with an affinity to technology, it was also a very wonderful, extraordinary time to become extremely tech savvy very quickly, because there was so much to sponge and absorb. And as we know, our growing years are the most formative years where we are able to literally learn whatever is given to us. And I think it's a time of impression as well. So whether you were a preteen, a teen, or a young adult, technology impressed everyone in their own way. But I think it had its biggest markings on this generation, and that's really where I'm basing my argument on the ability to absorb technology at such a fast pace.
Yeah, and it's true. Technology is the thing that really sets millennials apart from zillennials. It's that the rapid change in technology that really makes it prominent for us to even coin this term zillennials. No, I think that helps us navigate the rest of this conversation fairly smoothly, because this also takes us into what actually makes zillennials so different from millennials and Gen Z. First of all, Zillennials had a fairly analog childhood, but a very much digital adolescence. we remember life before social media took over, but we were also young enough to adapt to all of these quickly emerging technologies fairly efficiently, effortlessly. We've used both MSN Messenger and TikTok, though at fairly different stages of life. Unlike pure millennials who remember the early days of Facebook when it was just for college students, or Gen Z who grown up with Snapchat and Instagram, us Zillennials witnessed the entire evolution of social media, all the way from MySpace, in its prime, till us jumping on the bandwagon that is TikTok. Not me personally; I've not actually used MySpace or TikTok much, but the rest of my cohort, at least the most of my cohort, would be able to say that they have. And this unique perspective has made us more aware of how social media has transformed society and often more cautious about our online presence. We are digital natives, it's true, but there is this element of digital skepticism. And Goldie, as someone who works with this cohort of people, what are some differences that you noticed?
I'm going to answer this in two parts. The first part is that what I observe on a personal level with the early millennials that are close to me. I also was very much a part of when Facebook first came out, along with the many other platforms that have emerged since. I, of course, belong to a completely different generation, but my observations have been the following. The word skepticism has stuck out from your narrative earlier on. A lot of the early millennials that I'm friendly to or are family to me, I noticed were fascinated by Facebook when it first emerged, and they used it pretty frequently, if not obsessively, for the first, I would say, 3 to 4 or even 5 years. And suddenly, I would say in about 2015-16, yeah, there was a slump in the way they approached it. There was almost a repulsion that they felt. And I think they recognized that there was an excess of something that was not good for them. And I don't know if it was because of what mental health problems were coming about. They weren't really that relevant in 2015-16. However, a lot of the early millennials that I know had stopped using Facebook, especially. So much so that, I have a very close friend who chose to just go completely off social media for good. And this is a person who was the pioneer of introducing me to social media. And I think for a good 4 to 5 years, this person was not visible on the internet, except for Twitter. And I think that is what sort of I've noticed, the long form of content, which is more Twitter based, even Instagram posts, is what resonates with early millennials. However, the latter cohort, which is the Zillennials, they resonate with TikTok, fast moving video content, and on the same platform, which is Instagram, they relate to stories rather than posts. So that's the fine line that I see. And in my workplace, which is the question to answer you, what I do notice is a very similar pattern. The clients that I work with, which are early millennials, they prefer to take their a simple example, their appointments on email with me, versus the later millennials. They are very happy to just program on WhatsApp or DM me. DM, the word DM also, it's come of age, hasn't it now? But it was so new back then via Instagram. And this has made me more flexible to their needs. I think that's a part which I just want to sort of underpin. As a cohort that is neither millennial or zillennial, I've felt the need to adapt my communication skills with them based on the platforms that they are comfortable using. And I never used to answer back on DM, but I do now. I see that there is a heavy need to do so because it brings in the business and keeps the communication flowing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think your mentioning of having to be adaptable, and the fact that you brought up how you see it in the workplace, uh, leads us on to the last part of this episode, which is what is the role that Zillennials play in the workplace. So, unlike many millennials who entered the workforce during the Great Recession with this hustle culture mindset, they had to, it's inevitable, or Gen Z who entered during the remote work revolution because of COVID. Zillennials started their careers right at the cusp of this massive workplace transformation, which is why we're often called hybrid professionals. We value work life balance just like Gen Z, but also understand the traditional workplace structures that millennials operated in or continue to operate in. We're comfortable with both in person and remote work, which makes us fairly adaptable as employees. And for this reason, we're also called cultural translators because sometimes millennials can't seem to understand Gen Z very well, and vice versa. And Zillennials kind of step in to bridge that culture gap. What's fascinating is our approach to professional development. While millennials often follow traditional career paths and Gen Z tend to at least want to create their own opportunities, Zillennials are fairly comfortable doing both or either. You might see them have like a conventional job while still running um, a YouTube channel or a Shopify dropshipping e-commerce store. So, Goli, what differences have you noticed in how Zillennials approach their careers compared to other generations?
It's interesting you mention the word hustle comes to mind, obviously, quite quickly, which is, I think, a word that Zillennials have really rejected quite profusely, based on the fact that, as you said, they had to adapt to this transformational idea of working in a hybrid structure. And I think millennials came into their working life when the Great Recession took place, which was a time of instability. So when you have instability, what are you seeking? You're seeking stability. And whilst millennials learned quickly to have to, multitask and be in two places at once, which also meant being either in an office, in a 9 to 5 structure, or having to go and work from home once COVID hit, they, I think, have almost paved the path for what Zillennials have really embraced to the core in their bodies and said, we don't really want to hustle anymore because we believe in work-life balance. Mental health is at the core of their values. However, we are happy to do a couple of jobs or have a side gig, hence the word gig economy, that very much, labels the Zillennials as well, versus the early millennials who are still coming from a place of wanting that stability, wanting that 9 to 5 structure, growing up seeing that, as the company, so the color. Again, I repeat this quote in most of our shows because you really do bring with you what you've been taught to wear, but you take off the robes as and how you must adapt to the situations that you're in. And as a small caveat I want to mention here, again, I personally did not come into my career until I was in my sort of early 30s, actually, because I chose to raise a family, have my children, and that was the sort of the structure of my own career. But so by the time I was in my early 30s, what I recognized was I was also a part of these millennials and some Zillennials too. And so even I noticed the need to do things on the side and not just be a marketing expert. It's that which led me to, write the book. And after that, carry on being an MC in certain places. And I still quite proudly, imbibe that side of me. But I don't think I would have done that had I been working from sort of the late 90s, which is when I technically entered the workplace according to my age and my cohort. So everything that you surround yourself by, I think really rubs off in one way, or another. So I think your early millennials are instrumental for pushing for more flexible hours, remote work options, wellness in the workplace. And what Zillennials have done have been more insistent on that idea of work-life integration, with a focus on mental health, personal time. They rejected the hustle culture more because the millennials themselves, the early ones, realized that this is not sustainable.
I think your experience of how you entered the workplace in your early 30s, around the same time that some of the elder millennials and maybe some of the zillennials also um, entered it, and how you started to adapt accordingly, I think really brings us very neatly towards the conclusion of this episode today, which is basically to talk about how the point of this episode is to highlight that generational boundaries aren't always clear cut. Micro generations like Zillennials, I won't take the other one's name yet. Maybe I'll wait for Goldie to do it in the next episode. So micro generations like ours remind us that human experiences don't fit neatly into boxes. They show us how rapidly technological and social changes can create distinct generational identities, even within a shorter time period. And understanding these nuances helps us better appreciate the unique perspectives that each generation brings to the workplace and at society at large. And that's how you actually mind the Gen Gap. And speaking of minding the Gen Gap, if you made it all the way until the very end of this episode and you liked it, please leave us a like, subscribe to this podcast, and share this with your friends of all ages and all micro generations also. With that, we've come to the end of episode 8 of Mind the Gen Gap podcast. I have been your host, Lakshan.
And I have been your co-host, Goldie.
Thank you so much for listening and watching. Or, let's just say thank you so much for tuning in and experiencing us all the way to the very end.
In true millennial style, huh, Lakshan? Muchas gracias.
See you in the next one.
Hasta pronto.
Bye.
Bye.